There was an article that came out a few weeks ago entitled, U.S. Humanitarian Aid Going to ISIS. Now, regardless of whatever the imperialist political establishment has said to excuse what they've called an alarming misfortune, while while pinning the blame on their proxy Erdogan governments in Turkey, the seemingly small, embarrassing mishap is actually the very way ISIS, along with other groups, were given their start with the direct and indirect aid of U.S. imperialism. Whether by their sponsoring of the so-called Free Syrian Army to destabilize, divide, and usher in regime change in Syria, or by the similar tactic of funding the right-wing fascist violence against the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela, this current period of imperialism brings with it a refreshing of an old tactic, the rebranding of the counter-revolutionary as revolutionary, of fascistic as democratic, and of democratically elected governments as regimes. It should be no surprise that ISIS is receiving aid through the USAID, the EU, and other international so-called humanitarian aid groups, operating with the sole purpose of promoting reactionary currents around the globe for imperialist plots. These groups are financially beholden to their imperialist backers and therefore operate for the same agenda as the Pentagon. The fact that the U.S. is using the Ebola crisis to deepen military hegemony in West Africa is one of the most opportunistic, vile, morally corrupt, and racist responses the imperialists could have chosen, while Cuba has sent various medical teams. Not only has the U.S. deployed 3,000 troops to the region, Britain announced that they are sending some 750 additional troops as well. Almost immediately after Ebola was found in the U.S., the corporate media paraded out every racist politician and commentator they could find to push for further militarization of the borders and discrimination against immigrants and communities of color. As with the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 80s, these calls for the U.S. to do more were met with the only solution imperialism has ever offered during a health crisis. The U.S. government first had to obtain the patent for the vaccine. This suggests that the reason they aren't doing much in the way of practical solutions is because the U.S. stands to potentially make billions as the crisis deepens. This is medical apartheid. This is the same imperialist system that sponsors reactionary movements everywhere to sow division, such as the U.S. NATO-backed military coup in Ukraine that ushered in a proxy government now using brutal fascist tactics of repression. It originates from the unending need for the capitalist system to continue to profit, expand, and have control over the global market for resources and cheaper markets. This process of global-scale division by the imperialists is now in a final stage where the West's only possible option for continued growth and profits is to redivide its former colonies. This division serves the purpose of ensuring that both their economic and military hegemony remained unchallenged. There is even an entire 2010 U.S. military guide that was leaked called the, quote, Unconventional Warfare Manual of U.S. Military's Special Forces, unquote, which details how the U.S. facilitates unrest in different countries by funding proxy insurgent groups loyal or opportunistic and temporarily loyal to imperialism. This is the model the Pentagon used during Nicaragua while funding the Contras against the Sandinista revolution, but have perfected it to coincide with Western human rights groups, the nonprofit sector, along with NGOs. It was operationalized in Libya prior to the NATO bombardment and is currently being used against Syria, Venezuela, Ukraine, Lebanon, along with the Kony 2012 in Uganda as an inroad to the Congo, among others. This is important to have an awareness of during this period of imperialist dirty wars and regime change that spans the globe, especially in order to be able to differentiate true revolutionary struggles from one sponsored and militarily supported by Western imperialism. Just to give an idea of how desperate, deep, and involved this imperialist drive to profit is, look at the lengths they went to in attempts to overthrow the Syrian government, a central figure in the axis of resistance to the Zionist military occupation of Palestine. This began in 2009 with the organizing, training, and arming of terrorist groups, which went into 2010 and 11 in Turkey and Jordan, primarily with the support of U.S. proxies like Saudi Arabia and Qatar. One article states the connection with Libya. Quote, in its drive to murder Gaddafi and the Libyan Jamahiriya in Libya, NATO had previously allied itself with so-called rebels affiliated with the Al-Qaeda faction, the Islamic Fighting Group in Libya. The resulting Libyan regime backed by the U.S. was in turn aligning with the FSA leaders in Turkey to provide money and heavy weapons for the insurgency against Syria. The State Department even hired a known Al-Qaeda-affiliated Libyan militia group to provide the security for the U.S. Embassy in Benghazi, although they had links with the very people that later attacked the embassy. This is how the U.S. established the training and arming bases for the FSA to go into Syria from Turkey and Jordan, a project the U.S. has been seeking to bolster with a request for an additional $500 million. Despite the fact that the Syrian Arab Army has been one of the only armies fighting ISIS, the U.S. has made little attempt to cover up the fact that they really aren't interested in defeating ISIS at all, with the recent bombing campaign against Syria. During the first 2 weeks of the U.S. bombing, one need not even have looked further than the headline, quote, U.S. hits ISIS oil targets in Syria, unquote. This is what they are after. In January, the New York Times reported that, quote, rebels and extremist groups have seized control of most of Syria's oil and gas resources, and that was over 60%. ISIS now controls some 11 oil fields in both Iraq and Syria. They control much of the water resources, such as aquifers in northern Iraq and Syria. The imperialist drive for profit is so intense that they are pushed to the creation of terrorist networks to gain access to oil. ISIS is their inroad and justification to gaining control of these resources. It is so obvious how interlocked the goals are here. In April 2013, the EU lifted sanctions on Syrian oil so that ISIS could operate the wells, and European companies were permitted to buy oil products from these areas. The U.S. even had a hand in providing the machinery necessary to operationalize the wells. It is said that this network to transfer oil is worth upwards of $800 million. It has even been proven that the U.S. has been purchasing oil from ISIS-controlled areas of northern Iraq and Kurdistan region. It is no surprise seeing that alongside areas controlled by ISIS, the most active oil and gas firms are ExxonMobil and Chevron, though their drilling operations have been halted due to this crisis. This explains why the U.S. has a sudden interest in ISIS, and why areas like Kobani in Syria are ignored by the U.S. Their drive to war has nothing to do with humanitarian concern, but a necessity to upkeep their profits and survival in ruling class power. In order to upkeep U.S. military occupations, bases, wars, drones, and the financing of thousands of contractors, the imposition of further austerity, and the deepening and intensification of racist attacks in the U.S. is occurring. This is the nature of the capitalist system. It is not due to one specific administration or a particular policy. Exploitation, division, and the pillars of racism, sexism, and anti-LGBTQ bigotry are at the very base of capitalism. They can't turn back. This is why anti-imperialist solidarity is so important and essential to a revolutionary movement. To stand in international solidarity with all nations under attack by imperialism, regardless of whatever secondary contradictions may be at play, and make connections through struggle, just as with Ferguson's solidarity with Palestine and vice versa, and Cuba's genuine act of internationalism in sending health workers to West Africa. Non-aligned countries and worker states in the global south have formed beneficial, bilateral economic partnerships that promote uplift. These partnerships counter the West's economic hegemony and have become targets of sanctions, grand accusations, and military assaults in the West. Our organization, Fight Imperialism, Stand Together, is a revolutionary organization that is proud to say that we are with Palestine, we are with Ferguson, we stand with Syria, we stand with Cuba, We stand with the Ukrainian anti-fascist resistance, and we stand with every struggle, both here in the US and globally, that fights against racist oppression, sexism, anti-gay violence, and imperialist war. As a comrade in Lebanon has said, quote, "In situations like these, our anger does not cloud our judgment, but merely functions as an expression of truth." Thank you.